I'm very honored to be in Athens today. So also that with my Belgian colleagues, the plane was not empty. Some of the Belgians came to Athens, and my colleague who is associated to BOZAR, Christophe de Jager, sitting here. Maybe you can stand up that everybody sees you. Please, Christophe. So, Christophe de Jager is the founder of the Gluon Foundation and is our associate at the Center for Fine Arts in the first place to do the work we are doing for so many years now. I thought it was interesting to show this first slide because it's an incredible building. For these who never had seen it, built and conceived at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. And I think it's important, like this building here in Athens, related to, I would say, the soft power of our institutions. It's maybe the most anti-Bilbao building, or I would say against the fetishism of architecture, what was becoming very important in the second half of the 20th century. Because this building is built under the hill between uptown and downtown. You see there a sculpture of General Belliard. Everybody knows in Brussels this avenue like here between the culture center and the Babylon Culture Center, other side of the street. I hope you have seen it. You know, Babylon was not so far away in the Old Testament, 80 kilometers away, I think, from Baghdad. And Baghdad, as you know, was the cultural center of science and culture long time ago. So nothing is new. So in this project was a visionary project at the end of the 19th century related to mainly what happens in Europe, related to economic development in the first place, and certainly science development. And I must say, globally, when we were looking for the last 150 years, it's not politics who is making the move in our society. In the first place, science and arts. We see it today all over the world, and certainly in the United States, related to populism. It's certainly a result of the high level of changes of technology, or makes that people are afraid of future. And so I would say, as a first statement, science is certainly leadership of change more than politicians can do. And it's related to this innovation. Again, to this building, it was an emanation of what was the global art, l'art total, the Gesamtkunstwerk. And if BOZAR opened, it was just after the First World War. And I'm coming from a village of West Flanders, like my colleague Christophe, and a village of Passendale. In spring 1915, you have to know, in that one village, in one day, 27,000 soldiers died in one day. And that was a new reality, that science could destroy the world. Related to the gas who was used during the First World War. And related to this very important change of the First World War, at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, related to migration, I would only repeat that 85 million people left the European continent, mainly to the Americas. And I think there are more Greek outside of Greece, as you know yourself, than in Greece. And so the fairness of and fear that we have about future related again to these realities we have confronted today. So BOZAR is as a trademark, and we decided today to make from this house an European House for Culture related to all the topics of democracy, European citizenship, related to cultural heritage, and what this heritage is meaning for us for the future, and certainly on the topic we are confronted today in innovation, the digital future. So you refer to the new narrative for Europe. We brought together more than 3,000 intellectuals. In the last commission, it was seen as too elitist. So the former commission with Juncker and Tusk was not so stimulating this debate on the new narratives for Europe. But we decided to work, and you can find on the internet, the concept of cultural workers for Europe. And cultural workers for Europe was in the first place to redefine Europe, truly to its more democratic body, and to find the necessary resource to innovate, and also to relate it to all these really challenges related to migration and also to the migrations who will come and the future's diaspora. And I thought it was interesting to show this painting of the City Hall of Siena. You know that at that time we had the Black Pest, and we know that coming to the coronavirus, in Siena, they were building in that period a new church. And if you visit Siena, you see that the cathedral is there by two walls, but was never ended. But it was interesting that through the Black Pest, who came from China, through Italy, all over Europe, took time, about 4 years, through all of Europe, that 70 to 80% of the European citizens died. And it's interesting to see that how in a city as Siena at the time, and we coming back later in my speech about citizenship and the new cities of tomorrow, how it was important to find already at that time, and I can only suggest if you go to Siena to go and see, it's about 10 paintings, monumental paintings in a period of analphabetism, how citizen participation was already very important at that time in Siena, and how they were finding a balance between nature and the city and sophistication of a city life, and at the same time, the reality of the surrounding in the reality of ecosystems. We had to live about security and how citizens could live together, and the reality of related to good and bad government, how citizens at that time in Siena were participating to forms of democracy where we try to build for so many centuries in our old continent. And from that time, related to BOZAR and this fundamental change of art and science in the Weimar Republic of the 1919 after the First World War, also related to Goethe, and we will see it later, but also already in 19, there was this fundamental idea of art and science. And that's the reason of the building of BOZAR, to bring these both projects together in one house. BOZAR is not a university. You have not this free space of an academic world. I'm not an academic. I'm not either a curator or an artist. But being director of BOZAR, I thought it was important to come back to our origins and to recreate this BOZAR lab. The most challenging thing for all our arts institutions is not to have a lab like IRCAM in the basement of the Centre Pompidou as a beautiful metaphor, but to bring this in our institutions all over the place, in all the projects we try to do, and not only in the periphery. So in the discussion of today, I will certainly refer to three main topics. The evolution of independency to interdependency. And second topic, the evolution from Renaissance to thinking to a more post-humanism. And third, the notion of peripheral peripheral thinking to a more collaborative practices. And that was also important in the way we went back to our origin. BOZAR is related to three types of departments. The classical departments, still always fighting to bring these people out of their silos. The music, the literature, as it's fantastic, well written on this wall. And it's fascinating to see in Athens, in my regular visit of the last years, to see that a public space, the common, the open space after attacks, that a new building on the seaside, in a popular area, a new library, is becoming such an important place here also in Athens today. How you bring art and science in a new situation. And for BOZAR, it was important that we could bring together these disciplines in a vertical way together with more an horizontal approach, a more holistic approach, and also the diagonal, where I will go more in detail related to the SDGs. All the ethical debates we started in the 90s, we thought it was for the South-South debate, and that in the United Nations 2015, the global vision, it brought it more to a global vision of North and South. And so BOZAR Lab is a reality today. Many projects were realized, and all that related to the project we saw in the 20th century, like the labs in the public televisions with all their projects, certainly related for the music world. You know, I was referring to IRCAM, but I could even refer to mostly public radio and television stations, where the most famous artists, from John Cage to Stockhausen, to the more complex music, to minimalism, were working in these open spaces during the whole 20th century, while radio and then later public television and television were so fundamental to innovate during the whole 20th century. I'm referring to this impressive image already because the historian Erik Hobsbawm speaks about these ages of extremes. We always refer today to what's happening today in our society, and how artists can be part of that debate of European angst, knowing what will come. And there, it's an impressive picture related to these gas attacks during the First World War. It's a very impressive image. Was using and the consequences of what happens in this postmodernism after the 80s, and certainly memory to this 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. We were winning a second prize, I would say a special prize in Venice this year with the project Mondecane. And interesting to know that related to these realities of the fairness and feel unfair treated, it's interesting to see, if you go on internet, you will discover our project we did in Venice with Belgian artists from a cooperative workshop related to Mondecane, and they 3D printed puppets related to the world of the past. We see a reality that we try to imprison ourselves in the past and coming back to the old traditions, not anymore wishing to innovate. And in this world of polarization and extremism, I thought it was interesting to show this work of Jonas Lund related to the Cambridge Analytics, related to how a populist as Trump, as you know, was winning the elections in working in this digital world. And Jonas Lund, as an artist, worked together with a Belgian company in innovation, Televic, and tries to see how also in the systems he was using, not only to use the fake news, but to bring a complete other news, the positive news about our society. And not only Joseph Lund was trying to give another message than the Brexit message, where we know later that finally the elite didn't vote and that we came to the Brexit. And even artists as Wolfgang Tillmann, famous artist living, Berlin artist living today in London, engaged himself certainly in that same debate when he was living in London and tried to do the whole debate of the Brexit to change to his artwork and his messages to change the metaphor and influencing also the public opinion, what Trump did, and again in these coming elections in the United States. It was interesting to see how he was trying to make the difference. And I think that's interesting to see how he unfortunately failed in his project. But again, it's interesting to discover that our artists are part of that debate. In these projects from the artist Anssi Pulkkinen, Street View, it's in front of the building BOZAR, and it was just after the big migration crisis. We had most of the Middle Europa, Central European countries after the First World War were firing their 100th anniversary of independence. And related to the first topic of how we are independent and interdependent, and now we have this romantic idea of how we were increasing borders in the 19th century to create these our national identities by creation of nations. This Finnish artist was showing this independence by bringing some results of a destroyed Syrian house. We had to bring all over the borders, negotiating with the different armies and the Turkish authorities to bring this work to Brussels and then finally to Helsinki. And it's showing really that this individual independence cannot exist anymore today. And we see it even in Belgium. During that First World War, as citizens decided to build BOZAR, it was a citizen engagement to bring this project reality after the First World War. It was an investment being a second economy, and it was, I would say, a lot before the larger foundations who are like the Onassis Foundation today and many other foundations in Europe and all over the world. It was an incredible project of 200 families who decided to build BOZAR. And it's interesting to see that even Belgium was the second economy in the world when BOZAR was built, and trying to challenge these same problems we challenge today. It's interesting to see that as an historian of economy, that in 100 years, the Belgian economy was losing each year, and that's why the reality of an European space, an European cultural space related to an European economic space is so fundamental in a globalized world, and how artists related to these themes of independence are fundamental to works on these metaphors. And I thought that showing these rivers related to also our European system it's an interesting, I don't know what's happened. Yeah. It's interesting to see the European space and the rivers, certainly related to development, economic development and cultural development related to the Low Countries where I'm living, and all over Europe, how culture is developing itself, and how we know that delta regions all over the world will bring migration and migration to cities. As we know, more than 80% will go and live to these delta regions, and how in these cities of tomorrow we will live. Fundamental works were done on that, and it will be one of the big challenges of our society in this form of solidarity. And it's why I wanted to show this interesting presentation of the donut economy. I think you have already seen that the economist Kate Raworth made this fundamental presentation how you have to find a new balance between these ecological and social reality on which the arts world and more specific can be a part of the debate. And to find the right balance in the whole discussion, we have to create a new form of living together in the 21st century, and how we can make a balance of prosperous future related to all these topics. I will not go in detail, but I think that it's important to keep that in mind, and that engaged citizens can be part of that debate related to the European narrative and to make how technology is overwhelming our society. And we know that on that level, the Silicon Valley policies, we have to give new answers on that level. Related to, I would first come back to a form of new renaissance. I was referring to this post-humanism of this drawing of Da Vinci, and I would relate immediately to 1920, when Leonardo da Vinci is dying, and that maybe one of the most famous artists of just after Leonardo da Vinci, Dürer, was visiting the Low Countries. He was traveling a lot, and each time knowing the knowledge of the Renaissance, that leaving for sanitary reasons and healthcare, when something happened in the cities, he had to leave, and he was traveling around and coming to Brussels. And I could only refer to a very famous book of MacGregor on Germany, how this identity, European identity of artists, where everything was centered to human beings, was a fundamental development in the Renaissance. And coming back to this post-humanism, where we need to find a new balance in our living together. And from this Da Vinci reality, I'm coming to the organigram I found by the new site of Politico, how the Commission today tries to organize themselves, and how from the underneath of the slide, the commissioners in charge of the geopolitical realities and more specific in the new commission, how we have a new opportunity where Maria Gabriel, who was in charge for DG Connect, the whole digital development, who is now in charge of Breton on the right side, Maria Gabriel will have, and that's an opportunity for all of us in the debate of the coming day, is that she is in charge of education, Erasmus, and the different programs we discussed, but at the same time, she is for the first time also in charge, replacing two men commissioners. She will be in charge of Arising, not Arising 2020, but Arising Europe, and all research project. And I thought it was important for us in these complexities to show this slide on in which way the art world must be a part of that debate, where the different opportunities will be. The digital world related to the new financial program will be about 80 billion euro in the coming years, and how art and artists in the culture field can be a part of this discussion. And in the center, I would refer certainly to the Joint Research Center. As you know, Joint Research Center was the first research platform agency of the Commission, as you know, after the Second World War, related to nuclear research, and where Belgium was one of the leaders in the nanotechnology on security and measurement. And still today, I think, if we want to come to leadership worldwide in biotechnology, Belgium can be a part in the European Union in a form of solidarity in the research, coming to alternatives to find solutions to all the big challenges. And a joint research center is situated in the 6 countries where found the fathers of the European Commission. I thought it's important to relate to an important center who was helping us a lot already for the last decades. It's Nesta. Nesta was one of the first really platforms in the European Union, certainly when the UK became member of the European Union, and that one for €3 on the research is going to British universities, and hoping that after the Brexit, these part of brains will still be a big part of our common research inside the European Union, besides with the UK. But Nesta, with one of their professors in research, Francesca Bria, maybe you know her in different projects she was leading, was always showing how important art can be and how creative brains in innovation is so important to make the difference in our laboratory work today, and that economic development will be very important. Here it's more related to ethical thematics, where she, because she became, and I think I lost one slide, Francesca Bria, today she became the advisor related to ethical and digital innovation for the United Nations, but for the recent years she was in Barcelona, and I think it was interesting to see how somebody who came from the arts world and the cultural world was appointed to be in charge of smart city policies in Barcelona. And it's interesting to see what she did. If you go on the internet, you will find more information how she worked on new systems to, I would say, a new form of governance for cities, countries, and the world, how we can live in together. And I met her the first time in Alpbach. It's interesting to see the Davos, Alpbach, these important places where politicians, economic, business people come together. And if you have Documenta, Biennale of Venice, is where the arts world is gathering, knowing that the Biennale of Venice was trying to make a Davos for culture, but there's a big difference when you go to Davos. Business people go there and pay for their travel and pay for their spendings. In Venice, it was never working because you have to invite science and artists to come to these places. And sadly enough, many of these platforms were not always communicating. But Francisca Bria is maybe one of these personalities who is building these bridges between messages and between how to implement. And it was interesting to see in how after the terrorist attack in Barcelona, how she worked on data systems, not where we are different, you and me. She was working to bring data as a form of inclusiveness in our society and not to make police states where globally our digital realities are making new cities like in China, where everything is related. I was in the main control room of, not in China, recently in Seoul, and it was very impressive to see. And it was, I was really shocked how these cities are working today, and how freedom is becoming a real challenge to work on. So interesting to follow this discussion of Nesta in the impact it can have on our work. The project Data Boyded was a project we did with the Joint Research Center in BOZAR, it's for several years we try to bring these artists together and to see on a critical way with science people and artists, bringing them together with all the, I would say, the good and the less good results. But I think the last project we did in ISPRA, the largest center of a joint research center, where we were collaborating on this using of data and the impact it has on our society. In this slide, I think it's important to say that how an artist as Jonas Staal, who is a Dutch, in all systems like in GRC is transforming himself on the consequences of nuclear research related, for example, on earthquake situations where finally the periphery researchers become the center of the research. And here Jonas Staal is using and creating new alternative biospheres in old reactorenhalle, a former underground nuclear facility in Stockholm. And so he tries to create new alternative biospheres, really to rethink and to create the debate. And it's interesting to see how in a human, non-human reality, visiting these places and related to a poetic approach between art and science, and to create, I would say, not a space colonization, but a space cooperation, to create new metaphors in the world of, I would say, interplanetary alliances. Interesting to discover. In the art and science of this post-human life, it's interesting to see how Asagawa, in his project here, how the DNA can be manipulated and how it can be used in a way we know that we manage completely the DNA of humankind, how we have to challenge the ethical realities, how two women, if they would like to have a baby in a new, I would say in a new society, LGBT plus realities, having a child, and how I could, with my wife and with the DNA from a third part of a famous artist, I would say Luc Tuymans, if I would have a son who would be a good artist, how I can use and buy, and that's a reality not on a new society of inclusiveness, but a society of rich people with a new elite who could buy DNA to make and to realize new human bodies. And it's interesting to create the debate on that project. Related to algorithms and the reality of ethical behavior, I thought it was interesting to refer to the Neurons exhibition that Mathieu Cherubini organized in the Centre Pompidou. It's interesting to see how in a society where truck drivers and we will change, even in my region in Flanders, where already the labor reality is completely changed. More than 1.1 million in a community of 6 million people will go on retirement. So there will be a real challenge of new labor and to reinvent our society. So, but not only technology, but also thinking how we will use this technology in a new way of ethics and what can happen. And here it's a project on the way of accidents where the whole system of algorithms has to make decisions when somebody, elderly woman would pass the street, or there will be a child going, how the car will react, not on a way that artificial intelligence, and already in a post intelligence, because we are not speaking anymore from artificial intelligence, but already a more evaluated concept of that. And there we can see how artists have really specific skills to work with engineers on intuition, imagination, inspiration, storytelling, to make these things workable and to think on this future. On that level, the COP21 in Paris was interesting to see how Thomas Saraceno, artist living in Berlin, and who, with his development of spiders, structures, can help to reorganize, to refound the world. I saw his last exhibition, COP21 in Düsseldorf. It was interesting that how, together with NASA, he can really bring solution to society, to way that how data systems can work and to organize will better our society. And it's interesting to discover. So Thomas Saraceno in his workshop, it's really, when I visit these workshops as Thomas Saraceno or of Olafur Eliasson or William Kentridge, really people where they bring in communities and working in this form of interdisciplinarity and intersectoral approach where science, artists are coming together to reflect. And that's interesting related to that world of periphery. It's interesting to see that Humboldt, Goethe, Schiller on this discussing about Kant related to the Platon discussion already with Kant is how we have this relation with nature and certainly in these last 300 years we had a long discussion. I think that in this thinking of the periphery, I would immediately come to this peripheral thinking that William Kentridge was developing in South Africa. It's interesting to see that for Europe as France, May 68, everything was in Paris. And if you see an artist as Willem Kentridge who grew up in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s in South Africa, the reality of these social movements, new cultural initiatives was not only related to Paris, was related to, I would say, even in the Soviet Union, the black movement in America, the reality all over Europe, even at BOZAR, it was in May 68, the place of revolution, and how we have these important shifts in our society and how we can have these discussions. And it's interesting to see how politicians also always relate to historical facts, but it's a reality today that we never had such interesting reality. We can inspire ourselves to the past, but we have to look to the future. And here I think it's interesting to see one of my most inspiring artists is Michelangelo Pistoletto, who is by his 86 years old, is traveling all over the world still today, and really defending and creating still these, I think one of our main challenges of today, and most of the artists like Olafur Eliasson are inspired by the arte povera movement of Michelangelo Pistoletto after the Second World War. And it's interesting to see how he was referring to science with his infinity, the two first circles, and the first circle referring to nature. What was the basic of all relate to the second circle, and Vitruvius and Leonardo da Vinci in the Renaissance, everything became artificial. We are in an artificial world today. Even our relationships in all what we do in science, and already for a long time, Michelangelo Pistoletto came with a new form of configuration where he added a third circle and his third paradise, because mainly we were always thinking that there was always an end, that the world will be coming to an end. And it was more this apocalyptic idea of ending where Michelangelo Pistoletto was giving really hope of a new future, a new renaissance, and he names himself a rebirthday. We made this project as an ambassador of this project. I think we did it all over the world with kids, with students, with in universities. We did it even in the European Parliament as an aspect of imagination for a new generation and finding a new balance between artifice and nature. It's important, related to this circularity, I give one example of Alexander Mankowski, who is managing about 1,400 creative brains in a company as Mercedes in Düsseldorf. Himself, when he was in our workshop, I think he was never referring to a car. He's already in this post-mobility world of cars, but it's interesting to see how is this philosophy in the very traditional economy of the car industry of Germany, and where they need this, and Europe, but certainly Germany, in this industrialization, come to a post-industrialization. And we see very well how himself on the campus of the industrial site in Stuttgart, how he finds this new way investing with new brains to come to a new future, and how he brings these creative brains in innovation together and to bring as a, I would say, a collective imagination between all these scientists, artists on a same platform campus from where we create new forms and new ideas. So to end, I think it's important to know that BOZAR, and there you see this building beside the bank, it's interesting to find in a new form of capitalism where these 200 families were creating. It's important that BOZAR is a part of an European network. We cannot be independent. As I said already, we can only making these projects, and I think the European Union was stimulating that. I think that centers in the periphery relate also to Greece and the reality of the discussion here and the solidarity that we need to have also in these new migration crisis that Greece is confronting. It's not a crisis of Greece, it's a crisis of Europe. I was a little bit shocked by the images of the leaders of the European Union looking from an helicopter to the borderlines between Turkey and Greece, but it's an element of solidarity. It's a difficult answer to give. I think on that level also there, how we do the work on education related to these fundamental crises of migration and migration to cities. We know that 80% will go and live in cities. We know that in 2050, Africa will be doubled in numbers of inhabitants, and in 2100, 40% of the world community will be African. And that I saw recently 150 cities and commons in Germany asking against their national government that migration has to be embraced. So we have to find a new balance in this new way of policy. And knowing that BOZAR is there trying to restore, to be open-minded, to create a more greater solidarity with the city where I'm living in Brussels, the laboratory. In the area I'm living, around 1 square kilometer of my apartment, 186 languages are spoken. So this cosmopolitan reality, where we have the fear of the other, how we can bring together that we want to live together in. And I think there, the middle was this idea of Gesamtkunstwerk from the Weimar Republic from 100 years ago, and I integrated that as a diamond where we have this dialectic of where everything is coming together. And I think in a book we wrote with our staff the last 4 or 5 years, where would we go and in which way art centers as the Onassis Foundation, many other institutions, how we can create this solidarity between all these way of working together, and not anymore to be in an interdisciplinary reality, but in this intersectoral reality of media, science, research and development, and how we can have this solidarity of international cooperation, why it was important to come to Athens and to have this discussion with you in the coming project of the Commission, and showing empathy, also a form of resilience of the form of what happens. I'm living less than 1 mile away of the most democratic body with the European Parliament. And where we have to show, and that's also, I need you in the work we have to do to this member of Parliament. Even we cannot elect the best members of Parliament because we have still not a federal all-over European system to create this new way. But I thought that it was important that we were part of the STARS program. We know that many universities worked on the STEAM and the STEM, where arts become a part, but I can say that my Brussels is the largest university of Belgium with 65,000 students, and by the reopening of the academic year this year, there's a dropping of 50% of social science students for the last 10 years in Belgian universities. So the balance between social science and arts and philosophy is fundamental if we want to have a development of technology, and at the same time they need us and we need us. So it's and their starts, I must say, it's a small program. It's an important program with the other programs that that Europe was launching, and we hope that after the Brexit budget discussions, many countries want to reduce fundamentally the budget of art in the European policy. I think it would be a big error in the strategy and policy. I thought that it was interesting to see how in this family company that you see here, Otto Bock, a Berlin-based company, was one of the prize winners in Ars Electronica Linz. How important it is to find new balances in neurology and the way that when a workman today would have this accident and have the arm, how you have to work on neurons related to a digital world of flat screens and so on. And it's incredible how they made an incredible result. All the skin is related to the feeling of warm and cold, and how the whole system is working. It's a fantastic realization from artists and engineers who work together in this project. To make a long story short, we had a big festival last weekend on Africa. For the last 15 years, I'm involved, and I can say that it's a big debate we will have for the coming years, also all over Europe. You know that strange enough knowledge related to libraries and knowledge building, that strange enough 5-6 countries wrote books we have in our libraries. And we have no books of intellectuals from Africa. And strange enough, they were the first printers of books before the printing started in the Renaissance in Europe. And so there is a really big debate related to the old colonizing countries, where mainly Belgium, France, Germany, Spain, Italy are the countries who had this experience. And in my capital, 45 million objects in the Natural Science Museum, the Africa Museum, are today related to the origins of Africa. And so I thought it was important in these borderlines, in European space, in European participation, we need to embrace also this visionary Africa in the work we do. And we will start with the first Start Africa project. I refer also to Kigali, where Kagame brought together, it was in the New York Times 2 years ago, for the first time, 1,000 scientists and artists to Kigali. And we did a master plan of the city of Kigali in the 25th anniversary of commemoration of the genocide. It was an important event where we brought 60 African architects, young architects, to rethink the contemporary African city. So it's only a small part. We will be present in 12 weeks in the Dakar Biennale related to the New Start Africa program. And Studiopia is the most recent project we will start on, and that's completely referred to my colleague Christophe Diag, who could tell more about that during the day tomorrow if you in our informal meetings, how we are convinced that private companies need to embrace also to bring to connect with artists. And it's interesting to see that's not the way that artists have to go behind technology, but that is the other way around. We need to bring again engineers in the workplaces of artists. And we started to do that with a lot of companies, together with Christophe and his foundation, Gluon, in which we are associated. And the results are incredibly interesting, how we connect these people on that level. And to end, I thought it's important to relate to Next Generation, Please. It's a fundamental project I started several years ago when we do not understand anymore democracy, when it's too complex to know what is happening in the agora, in the place of encounters, when we need to speak about a language of how we live together. Was it interesting to see that with young adults, we decided that we will translate these complex ideas on which we will discuss these days in images. And it's interesting to see how young adults, 16, 20 years old, together with politicians, and you can have Herman Van Rompuy, the former council president, is a Catholic conservative, with an artist who has a completely other thought, but that you can see that they're independent and interdependent, even they have completely other views of society, that they can sit together between an artist, a scientist, and a politician, and how they can be ambassadors in a dialogue with schools. And we studied it for the last 5 years, all the results. We connected with 100,000 students to embrace these new values, the values of our society, and to make and translate that in these images and artworks, and also to show these works in a museum place, in an art place. So the schools are not only art schools, all type of schools related where we did this work. And so I can end and conclude that BOZAR tries to connect, and if we are here, is to have an open discussion on these different topics. I thank you.